Hi, I am Khalid Long, and I am the Vice President for Advocacy. Additionally, I am an Assistant Professor of Theater and African American Studies at the University of Georgia. And I have with me Samuel Yates, who's an Assistant Professor of Theater History and Directing in the School of Theater and Dance at Millikin University. Sam, did I get that all? Did I
That
get
is
that all?
all right.
Okay.
Yes.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you for joining me for this edition of Snapshot Conversations. As you know,
Thanks
our
for
goal is to have a discussion about some of the important areas within our discipline and to bring it to the front and not simply theorize and historicize, but our goal is to really sort of implement a kind of action. Yeah, so thank you for joining me.
Of
Um,
course,
yes, and today we're going to talk about theater and disability.
we are.
So Sam, I have some questions that I'm going to pose to you, and I figured we'd just jump into a discussion. Sounds
Great.
good? Good.
Perfect.
So I have a couple questions. So let me just go with number one,
Okay.
and that is when one says theater and disability, what are the positive aspects that come to mind, and also what are the not so positive aspects?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's perhaps useful to first distinguish between theater and disability theater because they're
Okay.
not quite the same thing. So, disability theater is a term that generally is applied to representations of disability within theater practice. But disability theater uses physical and cognitive disabilities to really express and celebrate the range of cultural experiences of the human body without necessarily needing a medical cure or that kind of cultural imperative towards cure.
Okay.
And this is, I think, particularly different than disability and theater, right? Which is really about representations of disability in theater, but it might not necessarily be disability led or disability artist led.
Okay. Okay.
So I think that this gives us to some like promises, right? Or promising facets. The most positive elements of that combination of disability and theater that you were asked about is really where we see educational theater and our industry taking um, the disability rights maxim, nothing about us without us, as a charge to ensure that disabled artists are involved in creating roles and stories about disability. Um, I think that that promise really can challenge us as scholars and artists to reevaluate their approaches to performance works that might not be engaging with disability culture, its people, its politics. Um, from my perspective, I think the obverse side of that, those not so positive aspects you were asking about, is um, I would say continue to be scripted retrograde beliefs about what a disabled body can do. Um, Casting of non-disabled actors to play
Mhm.
disabled roles without doing the complementary work of
Mhm.
casting disabled performers in scripted roles that are non-disabled.
Right.
And then more broadly, just the lack of education and funding, because it's about money as well, around basic access measures.
Right. Right. Well, let me pose a follow up. From my own research and reading in terms of engaging in this topic, um, we often talk about folks on the stage and telling their stories.
Yeah.
But what about the folks who want to work in the theater as directors, as designers? How are they a part of this larger conversation?
So, I mean, I think that they are absolutely a part of this larger conversation. We talk about, for example, the world of the play, right? That is a central conversation to every artistic process. Is your world of the play accessible?
Right.
On a fundamental level, we see this in a play like Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. Um, an autistic designer is going to design that show incredibly differently than a neurotypical designer if
Yes.
you are creating a world that is supposed to be indicative of Christopher's mental landscape. There's going to be a different kind of facility and stage language that accompanies that. Um, so, I mean, I think that it's absolutely a question of representation and access. But
Right.
when I say access here, I mean, I don't just mean like ADA compliance. I mean
Right.
actual access to creative opportunities
Right.
that will
Right.
inform the process at every stage, not just the final performance that an audience sees that laboring actor.
Right.
How
Right.
did how did we get to the conceptualization of the show? I would argue even something as early as season planning.
Right.
Um, you know, how diverse is your season? We talk a lot about racial and sexual diversity in terms of representation. Um, I've yet to see a season that I would say is or a season process that is really engaging with not only disability alongside those consistently, but also the diversity within disability itself,
Mhm.
right? Because it's not a monolithic category.
Right. And I think also we can, and of course, I don't want to, I have more questions for you, but I also just want to add to this, right? That we also can think about audience members, right? You know,
Yes.
creating, and this is sort of around the realm of theater architecture, right? Like, do we have spaces that are inclusive, right? Where folks can get into the theater with easy access.
Yeah, I mean, this is a central problem, particularly if you were thinking about like New York theaters, right? Many of which are functionally inaccessible, or aspects of their theater are inaccessible, like the bathrooms. If it's not a space where spectators can feel welcome,
Right.
then they're not going to see it as a space that values and reflects them.
Right.
And we see this both in our physical spaces, in professional theater spaces, but we see this in a lot of university training grounds too. Theater companies, or theater departments rather, are historically underfunded compared to STEM fields.
Right.
Working in buildings that are pre-ADA, and a lot of times many of the shifts that need to accompany those to make those spaces compliant, or accessible, only come when there's a student
Right.
who's specifically requesting that access tool.
Right.
But if it doesn't already exist, a student won't see themselves as being able to function in that space, so then they're not going to join that community. So it
Yes.
becomes a little bit of a cyclical problem.
Right. 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 Thank you for that. I'm going to go to question number two.
Sure.
Keep us going here. So, what are some of the ways that theater practitioners, from commercial theater and community theater to university training programs and school productions, can be an advocate?
Right. So
Okay.
I'll admit, I get a little nervous around the word advocate with respect to disability, because historically, medical, legal, familial, and parental advocacy is used as a tool sometimes to disempower disabled people from their own autonomy. Um, but I think that there are ways that we can think about being better colleagues or collaborators or co-conspirators with disabled artists, to help, first off, just get people in the room, right? That's a first step.
Right.
Um, are you casting an inclusive are you writing an inclusive casting call that
Right.
makes a clear commitment to all ability casting? Or is your company naming valuations of disability beyond sort of the boilerplate that exists on all like
Right.
legal frameworks?
Right.
Um, Asking auditioning artists upfront about accommodation requests, not only within the audition room, what they need to flourish in that space, but about the longer creative process, because that might mean rehearsal schedules look different.
Right. Right.
Um, this is super important, particularly if we're talking about our larger conversations about, are we doing away with 10 out of 12s?
Right.
Um, what's the sort of bodily labor component there? Um, I think that this is important to note because as disabled people, we're really skilled at navigating inaccessible structures.
Mhm.
But if we have help, co-conspirators, in dismantling our access barriers, then that's more energy that we can put into our artistry. So asking for some of these things up front signals at least some base level of disability consciousness.
Right.
So it helps telegraph that a company member is open to having those conversations.
Right.
Uh, from a university training program side, I think that there's a lot of work to do in terms of ensuring that curriculum, processes, and physical spaces are accessible.
Yes.
This includes functionally also hiring disabled specialists
Yes.
and faculty members to help ensure that that work exists within these structures. Um, when I talk a lot about this work, when I talk about this work as a disability consultant, which is one of the things I sort of moonlight as, I
Okay.
get a lot of pushback about
You
the
get pushback.
expense of accessibility because it's expensive.
So
Um,
you get pushback.
I get pushback when I say, well, ABC needs to change, or you should invest in, you know, a budgetary line for, let's say, interpreters,
Okay.
right? It's expensive. In some cases, it might require spatial retrofits or new builds. It's additional labor. It's additional technology. But I find that people tend to have a lot more buy-in when we stop framing accessibility as a like tacked on thing at the end of a process or a bare minimum legal threshold of compliance, um, but rather as this ethical commitment to solidarity within our community. So
Right.
it's functionally like working to reframe it from a we did the bare minimum, so let's move on, to asking how is our work made different and possibly better
Yes.
through working accessibly?
Right.
And that question helps us reframe disability access and equity as a way towards artistic flourishing rather than thinking about access and the fiscal support we have to bridge with access as a barrier for artistic flourishing.
Well, what it seems like you're getting to in many ways is sort of extending or broadening the idea of community.
For
In
sure,
okay.
absolutely. Um, I mean, it's important, I think, to think about the ways in which this work is different in part because it's about cross movement solidarity,
Right.
right? So that does mean attending to inequities of racial violence and white supremacy and ableism and homophobia, all of these things within our field um, and our industry, even when disability isn't explicitly named.
Right.
But that gets us to, these larger principles that come to us from disability justice, Black feminist thought, that
Right.
collective solidarity also moves us towards collective liberation.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
all of these things together.
Yes, 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 yes. You touched on my next question, but I want us to think, the pandemic pushed us to, think critically. I hope, that it has pushed us to think critically about disability and access, perhaps in new ways, right? But are we doing enough, right? And if not, what else can we be doing as a community?
I would say short answer is no.
Okay.
We're not doing enough.
Okay.
In part because the moment you see these calls to come back to some sort of normal, right? The pandemic's over.
Yep.
These ways that people are unmasked and have returned back to daily life in ways that approximate pre-pandemic life.
Right.
A lot of the access tools that were present during the pandemic have now gone away.
Right.
Something like digital access to works
Right.
or Zoom access to audience engagement events, these sorts of things that the pandemic revealed were always possible, but weren't seen as desirable because the vast majority of able-bodied patrons and artists weren't asking for them.
Right.
So it becomes this kind of like numbers game. I think you're absolutely right, though, in the sense that our ongoing experience of the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity for us to reconsider our relationship to disability, given that now the majority of the globe has in some way experienced something of disability culture.
Right. Right.
Um, we've now have individuals across the population who have experienced forced quarantine, medical crises,
Mhm.
the debilitation that might come with being temporarily or in terms of long to COVID, um, debilitated for lengthier periods of time, um, having to function as caregivers, all of these sorts of things. I think that our rapid adoption and acceptance of these modalities um, just underscores that it was never really about our ability to adapt to accommodations.
Right.
Our accommodations are just seen as unpopular or extra work or as a financial burden.
Right.
Um, I think that we can all do more. I think our goal is now to learn the lessons from harnessing these tools rather than pushing them aside in this return or in an eagerness to return to a new normal.
Right. Right.
Because not all of us can return to live and in-person
Right.
events.
And
So,
I do understand people's, sort of the foundation of that statement, right? I get it, right? Like I understand that people I hope anyway that they're thinking about a way in which we can get back to be productive, whatever that means. But I think that the issue at large is, who has been able to be as productive as needed to be or can be. And I think it's forcing us to really think about what that means as well. And I also understand that for some people, this idea of normalcy is about getting to a place where they can sort of forget, a brutal period in
Mhm.
our current history, in our current moment, excuse me, that, essentially we'll be writing about for a long time as an important historical moment. And at the same time, it has forced somebody like myself to think about disability, particularly, within the context of being invisible, like, the idea that not all disabilities are visible, right?
It's
It's
true.
forced me to think about that, right? Yeah, yeah,
I think for me, central to this like moment of this like return or however we want to narrate it, or and we'll be narrating it in different ways for the next decade and longer. But there's this moment of rapid expansion of community, right? Where suddenly these tools that many of us have been advocating for a long time, simple things like open captioning,
right,
right?
right,
Um,
right,
suddenly became a cultural norm because most of the population needed them. But in our return back to some semblance of before, um, there's then it demonstrates an active choice to no longer include these community members with whom we had to actually rely on because those were the experts for disability accommodations and access accommodations throughout the pandemic.
yeah,
So there's this weird double logic happening, right? It's like we recognize that you have the skills and the access, this technology becomes central to us. Therefore, you are now included here. You are no longer central to us. Therefore, we're just going to immediately, thanks for your input, thanks for your assistance. Now goodbye.
right,
Um, and I think the next step is ensuring, hey, wait a minute, actually, that's talent and intellect and artistry that we need
yes,
to help push ourselves, push the field further, push our art forms further.
yes,
Um,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
I hope that this is the beginning of a broader disability consciousness, um, but I am not immediately enthused by some of the practices that I'm seeing companies abandon so readily
yeah,
after working in really accessible ways for the better part of 2 seasons.
yeah, yeah. It's unfortunate, right? But I hope that, conversations like this will continue to sort of broaden people's perspectives, right? Which then will force them to do a different kind of practice. That's
Yeah,
the hope, you know. I do want to ask one last question.
sure.
I read an article a while back,
Mhm.
that said theater and disability should not, end quote, should not exist under a banner because once you put disability over the banner, it's not going to move the needle. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about that statement.
Sure. So that interview that you are citing is with Nick Viselli, who is the artistic director of Theater Breaking Through Barriers. And I
Yeah.
do think it offers some really useful ways for thinking through the tensions in and around disability theater, disability in theater, theater artists with disabilities who may not identify as having a disability aesthetic, crypt
Hmm.
performance, all of these different kind of complicated intersections that aren't exactly the same thing.
Right.
Uh, but Nick's specific quote comes from this larger context about his trying to combat regressive attitudes towards the professional capabilities of disabled performers.
Right.
And the company trying to resist a notion that non disabled patrons should engage with a company of disabled artists under a sense of duty, sympathy, advocacy,
Hmm.
or support. So when Vasily says that putting disability over the banner doesn't actually move the needle, it's not an explicitly anti-disability position um, in the way that it might sound,
Right.
but rather that it's an understanding that a larger cultural shift in the industry is needed. Um, Viselli wants people to engage with the work because it's good,
Hmm.
not because it features disability.
Right.
So I think on a practical level, he's right.
Right.
Commercial theater audiences rather, but I would say producers perhaps too, are inherently more conservative when it comes to disability on stage. I mean, we
Yes.
see this in our short-lived Broadway productions of Sideshow, not once but twice. And I think Sam Gold's Glass Menagerie is a really good example of this, where you have Sally Field on stage and the show still closes several weeks early.
Yeah.
Um, for me, I think that interview raises what I think is a perhaps more generative question, is about how to advance the fight against systemic bias impacting disabled people who are living in a non-disabled world, while simultaneously holding our commitments to reparative racial justice, gender parity, other facets of our equity work,
Right.
right? So again, thinking back to that cross movement solidarity, so that maybe disability itself doesn't move the needle, right? But when disability is put in solidarity with all of these
Right.
other movements,
Right.
um,
The collective.
are this collective momentum that we're seeing elsewhere already, right? You know, Time's Up, we see white American theater.
Right.
Uh, you know, when disability is put in conversation with all of these, I think that moves the needle.
Right. 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 Okay. Sam, this has been wonderful. But I do want to ask one last favor.
Oh, okay, of course.
For those who are interested to learn more and to engage deeper, could you provide for us maybe three sources that you would share to get folks started?
Sure. So I think a really great primer on
Okay.
this topic is Petra Kuppers' Theater and Disability. It's in the Bloomsbury Theater and series. It came out in, I want to say, 2017. And it's this accessible kind of crash course in the field of disability theater. It offers a historical overview of the field's development, performance analyses, and it moves kind of between, I would say, critical inquiry and autoethnography as as offering ways into the conversation.
Right.
Um, I would say next is Robert McCruer's Crip Theory, Cultural Signs of Queerness and Disability, by New York University Press, or with New York University Press, 2006. McCruer's book is a really foundational text for the Crip branch of disability studies.
Mhm.
So Crip theory is contending that disabled and queer bodies, desires, and communities not only expose the limits of dominant discourses on identity and democracy in the public sphere, but it also encourages artists and scholars and activists to write those discourses otherwise and to resist compulsory forms of heterosexuality and able-bodiedness.
So maybe
Um,
like a practical facilitating guide to some degree.
yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, theory is a tool, right? So I think that it gives a language for beginning to articulate
Right.
some of those issues. A more recent book that has just come out that I would highly recommend is Dennis Tyler's Disabilities of the Color Line, Redressing Anti-Blackness from Slavery to the Present. It's this really moving study of what Tyler calls an aesthetics of redress, um, that work with a wide range of sources to think through how white supremacy has wielded disability and disabling violence as a tool against black and brown bodies. And he offers this really beautiful reading of the coeval arms of racial and disability justice as a form of what he calls interability compassion,
Right.
where compassion and care between peoples of mixed ability forms are central to helping redress ableism, but also redressing anti-blackness.
Right.
Um, and then I know you said three, but I'm going to give you one more because I'm realizing it didn't actually offer work by disabled artists. A new edited collection of plays is out called Interdependent Magic, Disability Performance in Canada. And this is edited by the blind scholar and artist Jessica Watkin. And this collection is actually, I think, really great because it offers a snapshot of disability arts culture in Canada. There's four plays with a variety of topics such as sensory experience, blindness, sex and disability. And then there's a really beautiful answering a few introductory questions about disability section in that text that gives this really approachable facts, FAQs, about disability that you might have been wondering about, but maybe were afraid to ask.
Right.
And I think that Watkin in particular does a really deft job at guiding readers through the language of disability, to invite them to be co-conspirators in the creation of disability arts.
Okay. Thank you so much. Dr. Samuel Yates, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Likewise, thank you
You
for
and I
having
get
me.
together, we can talk all night. And so this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.